May 21, 1940, 14:45 hours. Farm lane outside Arras, northern France. Lieutenant Werner Schultz commanded a Panzer III in the 7th Panzer Division's advance through France. The campaign had proceeded with remarkable success. French resistance was collapsing, British forces were retreating, and German armor was demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of concentrated, mechanized warfare. Schultz's crew had encountered various French anti-tank weapons during the advance, none of which had proven particularly threatening to his tank's armor. His column approached a crossroads where intelligence reported British forces might be positioned. Schultz scanned the terrain through his optics, looking for the characteristic signs of anti-tank gun positions. He spotted what appeared to be a small gun emplacement between two stone farm buildings, a weapon so diminutive that he initially mistook it for a machine gun position or abandoned equipment. Anti-tank gun ahead, but it's tiny, probably one of those British 2-pounders we've heard about. Schultz's tone carried amusement rather than concern. Wehrmacht intelligence briefings had mentioned the British Army's Ordnance QF 2-pounder, a gun that fired projectiles weighing less than a kilogram. German tankers had taken to calling it Türklopfer, the door knocker, suggesting it would merely announce its presence without causing serious damage. Schultz ordered his driver to advance, while his gunner traversed toward the British position. Standard procedure when facing light anti-tank weapons: suppress them with machine gun fire while closing distance for main gun engagement. His Panzer III carried 30 mm of frontal armor and 20 mm on the sides, adequate protection against weapons designed for the light tanks that pre-war doctrine had anticipated. The British gun fired first. The report was sharp and distinctive, different from the French 25mm weapons Schultz had encountered previously. The round struck his Panzer's side armor at the junction between hull and turret ring. Schultz expected the metallic impact of a deflection or perhaps minor damage. Instead, the round penetrated completely, entered the fighting compartment, and struck his gunner before exiting through the opposite side of the tank. The shock was immediate and total. Schultz had been told the 2-pounder couldn't penetrate German tank armor at combat ranges, yet it had just driven a solid shot completely through his Panzer, killing one crew member and wounding another. As smoke filled the turret and his driver attempted to reverse away from the engagement, Schultz's understanding of British anti-tank capabilities underwent radical revision. That door knocker had just knocked a hole through armor that was supposed to protect against it. The Panzer reversed successfully, but Schultz's tank was combat ineffective, with 1 dead, 2 wounded, and the turret ring damaged by the penetrating shot. As medical personnel evacuated his casualties, Schultz reported to his company commander, "The British 2-pounder penetrated our side armor completely at approximately 300 meters range. Previous intelligence assessments regarding this weapon's capabilities appear to be incorrect. Recommend increased caution when engaging British anti-tank positions." That recommendation would be repeated across multiple German units in the following days as Wehrmacht forces discovered that the weapon they dismissed as inadequate was destroying their tanks with disturbing effectiveness. The gun nobody expected to matter. The Ordnance QF 2-pounder anti-tank gun emerged from interwar British military thinking about armored warfare. Planners in the 1930s anticipated that future tank combat would involve relatively light vehicles, fast, mobile, thinly armored. Anti-tank weapons needed to be portable enough for infantry to manhandle into position, light enough to deploy quickly, and powerful enough to defeat armor in the 20 to 30 millimeter range that contemporary tanks carried. The 2-pounder design reflected these assumptions. The weapon fired a projectile weighing just under 1 kilogram at extremely high muzzle velocity, nearly 800 meters per second. This produced a flat trajectory that made aiming simple and provided excellent accuracy at typical combat ranges. The gun itself weighed only 800 kilograms in firing position, light enough that crews could reposition it manually if necessary. The low profile made concealment straightforward. The simple breech mechanism allowed rapid fire rates in trained hands. The designation two-pounder referred to the projectile weight, approximately 0.9 kilograms or 2 pounds. This seemed insignificant compared to larger anti-tank guns other nations were developing. German intelligence initially assessed the two-pounder as adequate for its intended role, but unlikely to pose serious threat to German armor. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong because it failed to account for the physics of armor penetration at the velocities the two-pounder achieved. Armor penetration depends more on projectile velocity and design than on weight alone. The two-pounder's solid shot projectile, traveling at very high speed, concentrated its kinetic energy on a small impact point. At ranges under 500 meters, this produced penetration capability that exceeded what the gun's modest specifications suggested. Against the light and medium tanks that comprised most of Germany's 1940 Panzer force, the two-pounder proved devastatingly effective. British deployment doctrine emphasized concealment and ambush tactics. Two-pounder crews were trained to position their guns in locations that provided good fields of fire while remaining difficult for enemy forces to spot. Farm buildings, hedgerows, roadside ditches, and village ruins all provided excellent two-pounder positions. The gun could be moved into place by its crew, camouflaged quickly, and held in reserve until enemy armor entered optimal engagement range. This tactical employment multiplied the weapon's inherent capabilities. Arras, when the door knocker became a killer. The British counterattack at Arras on May 21, 1940, provided the first large-scale test of two-pounder effectiveness against German armor. British forces, 2 tank battalions supported by infantry and anti-tank guns, struck the flank of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division in an attempt to disrupt the German advance and relieve pressure on retreating British forces. The two-pounder anti-tank guns deployed with the attacking force achieved results that surprised both sides. German Panzer IIs and early Panzer IIIs, advancing confidently against what they expected to be disorganized British resistance, encountered anti-tank fire that penetrated their armor at ranges where they'd believed themselves safe. The flat trajectory of the two-pounder rounds made long-range shooting feasible, and British gunners proved capable of hitting moving targets consistently. German after-action reports from Arras specifically noted the effectiveness of British anti-tank guns. One report stated, "Enemy anti-tank weapons of approximately 40mm caliber achieved numerous penetrating hits on our tanks at ranges exceeding 400 meters. Previous intelligence assessments regarding British anti-tank capability require revision. These weapons pose serious threat to our Panzer II and the third variants and should not be engaged lightly." The German assessment of gun caliber was incorrect. The two-pounder was 40mm in bore diameter but fired a much smaller projectile than German guns of similar caliber. This confusion reflected German difficulty in understanding how such a small gun could generate the penetration they were observing. The answer lay in the projectile's extremely high velocity, but German intelligence took weeks to recognize this factor. Rommel himself acknowledged British anti-tank effectiveness at Arras in his subsequent reports. While he attributed most German losses to British tanks rather than anti-tank guns, a misidentification that was common in the confused fighting. His assessment noted that British anti-tank defenses were unexpectedly strong, and had inflicted heavy losses on German armor. The two-pounder had announced itself as a weapon that could not be dismissed. The tactical lessons from Arras influenced British employment of two-pounders throughout the subsequent French campaign. Gun crews learned that achieving surprise was critical. Firing from concealed positions at enemy armor that wasn't expecting effective anti-tank fire produced better results than engaging in extended gunnery duels where German numerical superiority and artillery support became decisive. The two-pounder worked best as an ambush weapon, and British doctrine adjusted accordingly. North Africa, perfect terrain for small guns. The North African campaign provided ideal conditions for two-pounder employment. The desert's open terrain allowed long fields of fire, where the gun's flat trajectory and high velocity produced excellent accuracy. The lack of vegetation meant that concealment required careful position selection, but the undulating terrain and numerous wadis provided abundant hull-down positions. Most critically, the relatively thin armor on early German and Italian tanks in North Africa meant the two-pounder remained effective throughout 1941 and into early 1942. British defensive tactics in the desert emphasized mobile anti-tank screens that could engage German armor at range and then withdraw before being overwhelmed. The two-pounder's relatively light weight allowed portee mounting. The gun could be carried on a truck, deployed rapidly when enemy armor appeared, and recovered quickly if the tactical situation required withdrawal. This mobility proved essential in the fluid desert fighting, where static defensive positions were often outflanked. The fighting around Tobruk in 1941 showcased two-pounder effectiveness in defensive operations. British and Australian forces holding the fortress employed two-pounders as key elements of their anti-tank defenses. German attacks repeatedly encountered anti-tank fire that destroyed or damaged tanks attempting to penetrate the perimeter defenses. The cumulative losses from these engagements forced German forces to adjust their tactics, avoiding direct frontal assaults in favor of more methodical approaches that consumed time and reduced operational tempo. Operation Crusader in late 1941 saw extensive employment of two-pounders in mobile operations. British armor and anti-tank units fought a series of meeting engagements with German and Italian forces across Libya. The two-pounder proved capable of engaging successfully at ranges exceeding 600 meters in the clear desert air. German Panzer IIIs and IVs discovered that their armor remained vulnerable to two-pounder fire at distances where they'd expected safety. Italian M1340 tanks were particularly vulnerable. The two-pounder could penetrate their armor from almost any angle at typical combat ranges. British tank units equipped with two-pounder guns as their main armament also achieved notable successes. The Matilda II infantry tank, heavily armored by 1941 standards but armed only with the two-pounder, proved effective against German armor when it could bring its gun to bear. The gun's high velocity and accuracy allowed Matilda crews to engage German tanks successfully despite the projectile's relatively small size. German forces learned to respect Matildas specifically because the combination of heavy armor and effective gun made them difficult opponents. The tactical reality was that the two-pounder remained dangerous to most German armor in North Africa through early 1942. The Panzer III variants that comprised the bulk of German tank strength carried armor that the two-pounder could penetrate from frontal aspects at typical combat ranges. Panzer IVs, initially deployed as infantry support vehicles rather than anti-tank platforms, carried similar armor thickness. Only when Germany began up-armoring these tanks and deploying them in larger numbers did the two-pounder's effectiveness begin to decline. What German forces actually learned. German tactical assessments of the two-pounder evolved from initial dismissal through grudging respect to eventual relief when more powerful British anti-tank guns began replacing it. The documentary evidence from Wehrmacht reports provides clear picture of this evolution and reveals what German forces actually thought about the weapon they'd nicknamed the door knocker. Early German intelligence summaries from 1940 characterized the two-pounder as adequate for its designed role, but not particularly threatening to German armor. These assessments were based on theoretical analysis of the gun's specifications rather than combat experience. The projectile weight seemed too light to pose serious threat, and German analysts assumed that such a small weapon couldn't generate sufficient energy for reliable armor penetration. Combat experience rapidly contradicted these assessments. Wehrmacht after-action reports from France and North Africa documented two-pounder effectiveness in terms that revealed genuine concern. One report from June 1940 stated, British anti-tank guns of approximately 40mm caliber have proven more effective than anticipated. These weapons achieve penetrating hits on Panzer II and the third variants at ranges exceeding 400 meters. The guns are difficult to locate due to small size and good camouflage. Crews demonstrate good fire discipline and achieve high accuracy. Units should treat all suspected British anti-tank positions as serious threats. The nickname Türklopfer persisted in German usage, but took on different connotations as the war progressed. Initially intended as dismissive mockery, it became somewhat affectionate acknowledgement of a weapon that proved more dangerous than its appearance suggested. German veterans who'd encountered two-pounders in combat used the term with more respect than their comrades who'd only heard about the gun through intelligence briefings. Captured German documents from 1941 to 42 revealed that Wehrmacht tactical doctrine had been adjusted to account for British anti-tank capabilities. Tank commanders were instructed to advance cautiously in terrain where two-pounders might be concealed, to suppress suspected anti-tank positions before closing range, and to avoid presenting vulnerable aspects when operating in areas where British guns might be present. These tactical modifications acknowledged that the two-pounder posed genuine threat that required procedural responses. German prisoners interviewed about anti-tank weapons consistently ranked the two-pounder as dangerous despite its obsolescence by late-war standards. One Panzer III commander captured in Tunisia stated, "The British two-pounder was effective against our early tanks. We lost many vehicles to these guns in France and Libya. The gun was small but accurate, and British crews were skilled. We learned to respect it, even though we mocked its size. Later, British guns were more powerful, but the two-pounder killed enough of our tanks to earn our attention." The technical intelligence assessments German forces conducted on captured two-pounders revealed understanding of why the gun had proven effective. German engineers recognized that the extremely high muzzle velocity compensated for the projectile's light weight, producing penetration capability that exceeded what the gun's specifications suggested. One technical report noted, "The British two-pounder achieves its effectiveness through velocity rather than projectile mass." This design approach differs from German anti-tank gun philosophy but proves effective within its performance envelope. The weapon remains dangerous to light and medium armor at typical combat ranges despite its modest specifications. The weapon that mattered when it mattered most. The two-pounder's historical significance lies not in being the best anti-tank gun of the war, but in being adequate when Britain needed it most. During 1940-41, when Britain faced potential invasion and fought to maintain position in North Africa, the two-pounder provided anti-tank capability that British forces otherwise would have lacked. The gun's limitations became apparent as German armor evolved, but those limitations didn't diminish its importance during the critical period when it remained effective. The strategic reality was that Britain entered the war with limited industrial capacity and substantial equipment deficiencies from years of inadequate defense spending. The two-pounder was available, in production, and proven in trials when war began. Developing and fielding a more powerful anti-tank gun would have required time and resources that Britain didn't possess in 1939-40. The two-pounder provided the anti-tank capability British forces needed, while better weapons were being designed and brought into production. The tactical lessons British forces learned through two-pounder employment influenced subsequent anti-tank doctrine. The emphasis on concealment, achieving surprise, and engaging at optimal ranges carried forward to 6-pounder and 17-pounder guns. The understanding that anti-tank guns required infantry protection and couldn't survive independent deployment shaped British combined arms tactics. The appreciation for high-velocity weapons over large-caliber guns influenced British anti-tank weapon development throughout the war. The psychological dimension was perhaps most significant. German forces that had encountered two-pounders in combat learned that British anti-tank defenses were effective and dangerous. This influenced German tactical caution in subsequent operations and increased their respect for British anti-tank capabilities generally. The nickname door knocker might have started as mockery, but it ended as acknowledgement that even small British guns demanded serious attention. Lieutenant Werner Schultz, recovered from his wounds and returned to duty with a different panzer unit, encountered additional British anti-tank guns during subsequent North African fighting. In a letter to his family, written in early 1942, he reflected on his Arras experience. The British two-pounder gun remains dangerous despite our improved armor. The weapon itself may be small, but British crews employ it skillfully, and it can still destroy our tanks if we're careless. I learned at Arras never to dismiss enemy weapons based on their appearance. The door knocker knocked a hole through my tank and killed one of my crew. That's not a joke. That's a weapon that demands respect, regardless of its size. That respect, earned through effectiveness rather than granted through reputation, was the two-pounder's achievement. It wasn't the largest anti-tank gun, wasn't the most powerful, wasn't the most famous. But when German panzers rolled through France in 1940, when Rommel's forces attacked in North Africa, when British forces needed weapons that could actually stop enemy armor, the two-pounder was there. It worked. It killed German tanks. It provided British forces with anti-tank capability that was credible even if not dominant.